So, welcome back to the Hive. Jo Dodds, Lorna Leeson, and today we're going to be talking about certainty, or we're reverting back to the topic of certainty, and the sense that we are moving into another phase of certainty or uncertainty. You know, at the beginning of this whole COVID-19 thing, we were all in the same boat. We were all facing the same level of being uncertain about the same things, and now it's almost becoming, there's going to be uncertainties and schools reopening, hospitality businesses reopening, second waves potentially coming, local lockdowns. You know, businesses might think they're able to get back up and running, and then 2 weeks later they have to put everything back on the back burner again.
It's like the boy with the finger in the dike, isn't it?
Absolutely.
One thing seems to be getting slightly certain, and then something else goes wrong, sort of thing.
So I think we just wanted to take some time today, didn't we, to talk a little bit about revisiting our thoughts around what you can do in an even more uncertain world. Jo, do you want to kick off?
I think the big part of it is just being aware of it, sort of acknowledging that is what's happening, and that brings with it all sorts of stresses and strains. And as you say, it's almost like when we started the lockdown, we were all pretty much, and this is very generalizing because obviously care workers, hospitals and everything else were, still in work and everything else, but most people were locked in their house doing work or not doing work, furloughed, whatever. But there was a sort of level of consistency, so it was all uncertain. We didn't know what was doing, but the certainty was, we couldn't leave the house. Whereas, as you say, now there's so many variables that actually I think the starting point is just to acknowledge that, and acknowledge that it's probably even harder than it was 4 months ago or 5 months ago. And back in that time I was saying, self-care was really important, and just sort of being aware of all of that. And I think it's, even more important now.
Lorna, where are you coming at from this?
I think acknowledging it, don't kid yourself. It's really interesting because it's such a human tendency. We love certainty so much, and you hear it in some of the language, particularly from some of the press at the moment. We're going back to the office, back to work, back to normal. Anything. Back to normal. We're not really going back to anything, and we're not really going back to the office, and it's not really going to look the same, possibly ever again in some cases. But certainly not for a while, and the focus and priorities and problems are very different. So I think if your mindset is, and this is very natural, is that we're just, okay, that was done, let's go back to this, then I think you are going to be in for a rude awakening. So just acknowledging that's the case, which means continuing to listen to people. Also, the thing that's different now with the uncertainty that we have right now versus where we were in April is that April was sudden shock, and we were all still in it together, but we were very much similarly in a similar place. The trauma that we've each experienced in the period in between April and now is very unique to each individual. And Jo, I do keep using your treat people as individuals thing before you get to it, but you've brainwashed me. So there we go. But we've all had a very, very unique experience of the past 4 or 5 months. And so you have to keep listening to people. You need to be willing to adapt, to say, right, we've got to get back to business as usual. We have to get back on track. The problem with that is that you do miss some nuances. So I'll give you one example. Home working has not been as it's been for our Jo sitting in her deck chair in her garden. It's not been like that for everybody. Some people have been in shared houses without a practical working space and are trying to do some really difficult jobs. Some people are in really precarious housing situations, and they still are. Some people have still got underlying health issues and can't just get on a train and go to work, however much we all want to be back in the office. So the principle of really listening to your workforce and truly treating them as individuals is almost even more important now.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, isn't it? I think it's important to remember and to actually people pat themselves on the back of just what they did achieve in that shocking period at the start of this whole thing, where none of us expected it to be coming down the track at us, and it suddenly hit, and my goodness, we had to respond, we had to do things, we had to act, and people did, and they by and large did it very well and learned an awful lot of lessons from that about great practice and what needed to happen, and really showed what could be done. Leaders came out of their cubby holes and made themselves visible. Line managers checked in with their people regularly. Internal comms rose to the fore. were taken seriously and given the strategic value to the organisation and recognised as being crucially important. You know, lots of really good things and lessons have been learnt. We learnt to be agile, we learnt to be digital, we learnt to embrace tech. So let's not, you know, let's remember those lessons, and let's remember to keep applying the learnings that we gained in that period, and dust off some of the things that maybe seem like ages ago, because it was like, oh, it was 4 months ago, you know. But dust off some of those things we did at the beginning, because you're going to keep needing them. You're going to need those
But it's interesting at the
templates and processes that you worked out in the heat of battle.
But it's interesting at the time when it first happened, we talked very much, and we said it again on here, that it was people behaving in a crisis. So it wasn't just working from home, it was working from home in a crisis. So it was like a really different scenario. And I think that's some of the challenge of now, that it is still a crisis, but it's not the same. It's more like a chronic crisis. You know, it's not, that's probably, those two words aren't going together. It's a chronic issue that's variable. And that's so much of the challenge, as you say, children going back to school, people who need to go back into the office for some reason or other, and whether you start going out into the real world or not. And so it's all, as you said, so individual, but also it is a bit like having, like we said, an acute illness or a chronic illness. This is a completely different scenario, isn't it?
There's a bit of, is there not, Lorna, do you think there's going to be something a bit like crisis fatigue? You know, it's how long can our energy levels sustain us? Because initially there's the sort of the adrenaline of everything. How do we deal with that?
I mean, as someone whose kind of thing is organisational change and how we help people work through change, I've heard for, you know, decades, you know, this kind of idea of the VUCA world, and I hate that term, but I think we do have to recognise, this is back to Jo's point about let's not kid ourselves, we have to recognise that this needs to be agile, to adapt, to respond to things, for things to fly out of the left field. That's not going to go away. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, Jo, by the way. I think I might have deviated, but I'm going to say it anyway. Change is something that your organisation is going to have to get good at one way or another. So having the infrastructure to be able to react quickly, communicate to people, make fast decisions, as we spoke about the other week with Buffer, having the ways of working, processes, culture, infrastructure in place that help you be agile in a world that is asking more and more that you do that. There's no going back to, we've got a 20-year plan and we're going to roll it out on a Gantt chart and everyone's going to stick to it and everything's going to be fine then and you'll all have a job at the end of it. We've learned this year, don't make those plans.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Was that the question you actually asked me though, Jo? I don't know.
No, it wasn't.
No, it never is it?
It's still very valid.
I've always got on a tangent.
It's very valid insight, so thank you for that. But no, I don't know, I was just wondering whether there was something around crisis fatigue, you know, how long we can keep going, you know, how our energy.
That's it, she says.
The one back in the room. Yes, probably. And so recognizing that and being able to take care of it yourself and not kidding yourself that actually you're back to normal and I should be fine and it should all be good and, you know, and grand and dandy. And we do still have to realize that we need to take care of each other as humans. Well-being is extremely important, and there is going to be a tendency for people to kind of check out of the crisis and try and revert back to old ways.
Yeah, it's over now. Well, no, it's not.
Yeah, I was talking to a client the other day who'd had somebody in the business had been made homeless during COVID. They hadn't told someone, and they were in a role where they were on the phone to customers. And the manager had said, it's just unprofessional, it's just unacceptable, it's just unprofessional. That's somebody who's got crisis fatigue, right? They're just so bored of having to deal with the human impact of COVID, the true human impact of COVID, that they're just going, oh, can't we just unprofessional.
Goodness.
That will happen, and we need to check ourselves.
Yeah. So bring again all the things we talked about in the early weeks of this series. Show humanity, treat people as individuals, Josie, self-care, communicate, be kind. You know, when there's uncertainty, if you don't communicate, people will fill the gaps themselves and make up their own versions. So, you know, keep people informed, even if you don't know absolutely everything. Inform them of what you can inform them about, and keep encouraging your managers and your leaders to be visible and check in. You know, that don't forget the great stuff that you started doing early on in this crisis that had such an impact. Don't get bored. Don't sort of say it's finished now, because it's really only just beginning, but in a different way.
Yeah.
Lovely. Great. Jo, Lorna, thanks very much, and thanks everyone for listening. Bye.